Hello, welcome to my channel, Save Infinity. So in this video, I just want to talk about a little more of a controversial topic, if you will, but an important one to be discussed. The topic of like military and war and violence and, defense force, all that sort of vibe. And just, kind of that unspoken truth of how brainwashed we really have been when it comes to those sort of things. And I know I probably shouldn't laugh per se, it is a sensitive sort of topic, but sometimes when you just kind of remove yourself in those sort of ways and alchemize such energies, it is a bit just like hilarious how silly it all can be. We really have been so successfully brainwashed in so many ways just to accept and normalize such things. It's funny with those sort of aspects of, brainwashing and propaganda of, when it happens on a smaller scale with a small little cult or something, we, act like, oh, that's so terrible and look at that brainwashing. But when it happens on a larger scale, more successfully and powerfully, suddenly we just act like, oh no, that's not brainwashing, that's just normal. When really it's an even more powerful and successful form of brainwashing. And I'd like to just, preface as well that I'm not, talking about this in a way to, shame or guilt people or anything like that. Myself, like when I was younger, used to, believe such things were honorable and, all that jazz, had family that have, been in the military and things like that. And through, culture and, media with war movies and all that sort of stuff, I did believe it was, an honorable, normal, sort of thing. And then, I just one day kind of used my, critical thinking skills to really just sort of assess the situation for what it truly is. And then you kind of realize like, oh, I've been brainwashed. So, it happens to the best of us. And I also understand that this topic is far more complicated than, this video kind of makes it out to be. However, if the point, of war and of the military, etc., truly were to, have peace and all that sort of stuff, it's like, why do we not still have world peace yet? And why do we not even have, peace properly within our own communities yet? We've been having war for thousands of years and we still don't have that peace, so it clearly doesn't work. And also as well, if it's about saving lives, etc., it's, well, what about the lives of the soldiers killed and and their loved ones, or the lives of the soldiers who do survive but are riddled with trauma and everything, and all the ripple effects that war has throughout the community in like a trauma sense and things like that. Why isn't there greater focus placed on that? Or, why isn't there a greater focus with all the sort of, time and resources and everything put towards these sort of things with war and the military, also put towards saving lives of the people within our own communities? People pass away and suffer through all sorts of horrible things all day, every day within our own, communities and countries. And yet that same amount of time and, money and effort and resources isn't placed on that. Or, why isn't the, same amount of time and resources, etc., placed on developing non-lethal weaponry? We could create some really sophisticated non-lethal weaponry where you still achieve the same sort of outcomes, desired without actually taking lethal means. When you kind of sit back and really look at all of that and think about all that, it kind of, makes you question and think, maybe it never was about saving lives and it was just about having a good enough excuse to take them. But, I find it kind of peculiar how, if someone kills someone, just in the general public, will, send them to prison for life and act like, they're an awful, evil murderer, and act like, they can never be trusted again and are an outcast from society. Yet, people in the military will kill thousands of people and we give them, medals and call them a hero. I know, people will say it's, a defense thing or what have you, but, so often, at least in, more sort of Western countries and stuff like I'm from, a lot of, the wars and things we've been involved in are in another country. Typically we would say self-defense, when it comes to killing, would be, an intruder comes into your home to attack you and you kill them out of self-defense, not breaking into someone else's home and, killing them all and then calling that defense. It just kind of doesn't add up completely. At the end of the day, whether it's, government sanctioned or, legal, killing someone is still a killer. A killer is someone that kills someone, and killing someone is a killer. Like, there's no, that just is what it is. As it can be quite a loaded term and word to use, but when you really kind of, just break it down to the basics and step back from it a bit emotionally, it's like a killer is a killer, whether legal or not, it's still a killer, it's still killing. Kind of like how, in all other aspects of life, we tend to say things like someone that just goes fishing on the weekend isn't really a fisherman. Someone who fishes for their job is a fisherman. Or, someone that plays football on the weekend isn't really a footballer. Someone who does it professionally is a footballer. Or, someone that builds a cubby for their children isn't really a builder. Someone that, builds houses for a living is a builder. Yet then when it comes to killing people, we'll be like, oh, that, that person that killed one person once, they're the killer. Oh, but people who do it professionally, no, they're not killers at all. They're just, it's like the mental gymnastics we sometimes do with these sort of things is, quite profound. And they often as well, a lot of sort of military type people and all that sort of stuff, and people, who condone the sort of, war and violence aspect, tend to, a lot of them also, believe and say they, love God and Jesus or are followers of God and Jesus. But if you think, if Jesus was alive today, do you think he would be serving in the military? Or, do you think he would be encouraging people to serve in the military? Like, I don't think so. And, we often say God is the opposite of the devil, right? Or the devil's the opposite of God. So if, you think God condones war and violence, then what does that mean the devil condones? The devil condones peace, love and harmony. Like, I feel, it doesn't quite add up. And it's so easy, for people to just go along with the flow of such things just because, it's told, that it's normal through brainwashing and propaganda. It's like all the devil has to do is just stand there and hold a Bible and say, if you do this, you're serving God. And everyone's like, woo, I'm serving God. And it's like, no ma'am, no sir, you're serving the devil holding a Bible. I know people, also love to say, well, it's, it's legal, it's government sanctioned and all this sort of stuff. But laws aren't truth. Laws aren't a moral thing to follow, that, a moral band of truth that you can, follow and abide by in that sort of way. Because laws change all the time and they're just, an imaginary thing we've created. But laws change all the time. Like, one time it was legal to have slaves, and one time it was legal to marry children. And, in the future, it could be illegal to engage in war and, kill people and stuff like that. So laws aren't really a good basis to kind of, base that sort of moral truth off of. They're just, an imaginary sort of thing we've created, and these rules that we've created that can be changed at any point in time. And truth, real moral truth doesn't change. It just is. That truth within, that God within sort of aspect doesn't change. It just is. And again, not saying any of this to, blame or shame or anything like that. Anyone who, has been, brainwashed by it all, which is, easy enough to happen, especially when it's on such a large scale. It doesn't have to feel shame or guilt or all those sort of things, because that's just, bringing you from one bucket of hell and dropping you into another bucket of hell. That frequency of heaven that we all want to ascend to and all deserve to ascend to. It doesn't include shame and guilt and all that sort of stuff. And, likewise from the opposite way as well, if you're dealing with people in your life that, are brainwashed by, certain things, not to be, aggressive or antagonizing or any of that sort of stuff towards such people. We want to be coming from a state of love and forgiveness and allowing that safe space for people to awaken to such truths and to kind of remove that veil of brainwashing and to rectify their make adjustments to their behavior as needed. We want people to have that safe space to do so, and not a space where they feel shamed or blamed or ridiculed or labeled as a bad person or something like that, because they're not inherently bad. Most people believing such things and acting and out and following such things generally are doing so with good-natured intentions of what they believe they're doing it for and all that sort of stuff. They're not actually trying to have bad intentions, majority of them. Just as, it's just how successful and powerful brainwashing and propaganda works. They're just a victim to that system. So we don't need to, outcast or, ridicule or bring down those sort of people, because then that just kind of, locks them in that box. You want to have that sort of love and understanding and forgiveness and allowing people that safe space to kind of, just have that sort of, new perspective on things and adjust into that new perspective. And obviously it's, been quite a, horrifying endeavor humanity has been going through in regards to those sort of aspects of war and violence and everything, and it can be quite horrifying to kind of see and accept that truth. But we don't need to allow the horror of it all to be another blockade for us to move on and away from that sort of aspect. It is what it is. What's happened has happened, but we don't need to allow those sort of feelings of shame and guilt and blame and all that sort of stuff and fear to block us from alchemizing it all and adjusting and evolving into a more healthy, harmonious, fulfilling sort of energy and way of going about things for humanity as a whole. We all deserve love. We all deserve forgiveness. We all, deserve the opportunity for healing and rehabilitation and all those sort of things on a macro and micro and macro scale. So we just, need that sort of bravery to face and accept such truths and then adjust ourselves accordingly, individually and collectively, in a way that is loving and harmonious and not, combative. And sometimes these sort of things can really seem more complicated than they really need to be, when we're operating too much in that sort of mental space, that is often meant to be used more as a tool, right? That real sort of more truth and aligned with God nature comes, from within. And then our brain is just kind of like a little tool that we use for, assessing and observing things. But sometimes we don't need to get, caught up so much in all the, semantics of it all and all the, how big and difficult things can seem, and instead just follow and do, what feels right from within, and allow the rest to sort of fall into place as it needs to. We don't have to do it from such a control aspect, right, where we try to control and change the whole entire reality. We just need to, kind of change and align ourselves within, and then, you know, all doing that individually, then reality just collectively will just kind of, you know, align and fall into place itself. Need to relax and go with the flow a little more in that way of just kind of allowing these things to just fall away on the, you know, by themselves naturally, and let all those sort of aspects to just, you know, dissipate, and allow that sort of brainwashing fog to lift, and then just, you know, kind of going with the flow from there, and allowing things to kind of be rebuilt and realigned as they do. Not having fear and worry with it, and really, you know, utilizing our empathy for those still, you know, brainwashed by it all, and just for the process as a whole. The more fear and guilt and shame and worry and all those sort of energies we exude, the more it's kind of just, as I said, you know, kind of just keeping us trapped in that bucket of hell still, maybe just moving us from one bucket to another, but still keeping us trapped in those bandwidth of energies. Instead, we just, you know, want to align and ascend to those higher frequencies of, you know, love, peace and calm, and just knowing as well, you know, from within and from that truth within, that, you know, no matter what really occurs in this reality and in this lifetime, that we still are infinite, eternal beings, and connected to God and to Source, and, you know, all that wonderful abundant nature of an infinite and eternal universe. And nothing can ever truly harm us in that aspect. As they say, you know, it's not like we actually are these physical bodies, you know, we are, you know, energetic souls or what have you, kind of, you know, operating these bodies in a temporary reality, in a temporary lifetime. And so who you truly are and what we truly are can never be harmed, and is, you know, always safe, and, you know, you'll always return back to that wonderful, you know, safe place. So not having to have fear or worry in that regard with these sort of things either. You know, all is well and all will be well. All right, well, I'll leave this one here for now, but sending you so much peace, love, light, and blessings as always. Bye.